7 minutes after dawn, the sea looks hammered flat, the horizon a wire pulled tight. 7th April 1945. East China Sea. Thunder without thunder. What awaited us was death and nothing else. The voice is calm in the headphones, calm the way steel is calm before it bends. He is a junior radar officer in a ship that should not fear anything, built by men tracing pale echoes with a grease pencil while the deck shivers at idle. Above the bridge windows, the wind stays strangely steady, as if the weather itself is holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the low ceiling of cloud, a geometry is forming that he cannot see, lines pulled across the sky, wedges tightening circles becoming arrows. He watches the scope as if it were a weather glass for fate. Each sweep brings back the same quiet betrayal, distant returns, faint but marching. Below him, the ship hums with the gravity of its own legend. Bulkheads thrum, pumps breathe, cables tick inside their armor like restrained rain. The main battery lies silent for now, each muzzle a dark tunnel, aimed at a horizon that no longer matters. The old math caliber range armor still lives in the steel, but the sea around them has been rewritten by radios and timing. He thinks of the brief he was given at midnight, a steam south draw. The enemy spend the fuel, never return. Orders that felt like a proverb now read like a verdict. A destroyer cuts across the bow and vanishes in spray. The ship's own wake is too clean, as if it fears to leave evidence. On the scope, the returns thicken, not a swarm, but a procession, disciplined and patient. He marks bearing and range, calls the numbers without raising his voice, and hears his own steadiness as something borrowed from the ship. Somewhere aft, a crewman laughs too loudly at nothing. Somewhere forward, in a compartment with no windows, men wrap ammunition in ritual. The officer touches the console, a reflex almost like prayer, and the screen answers with its soft circular heartbeat. The air smells of oil and lacquer, and the faint metallic sweetness that means fire is near, but hasn't chosen a place. He wonders briefly, treasonously, if size can be a kind of blindness, if a legend can cast a shadow so deep that it hides the shape of the century arriving overhead. Then the headphones bloom with code words and bearings, and the first thunder comes without thunder at all. They had given the voyage a name that made it sound like a story. In the wardroom at midnight, it was still a math problem. South to Okinawa, where an island was being ground flat under carriers and artillery, where the empire needed a symbol that could still move under its own power. The staff officer's finger traced a neat line on a chart, and then stopped at a place that was not a harbor. The ship would beach herself and become a fortress, a coastal gun on a scale to frighten history. The men around the table understood the grammar. Even if they did not say the last sentence out loud, there would be no coal smoke trailing north again, no ash settling back into Kura. The ships that went south would remain south, as iron reefs and empty names. The problem for the Japanese was not courage. It was petroleum and time, and the way both dissolve doctrine. Radar had been bolted to masts that were designed for flags and lookout aloft. Directors had been modernized in ways that looked modern on paper. But the sea had shifted from geometry to choreography, and choreography demands fuel and radios and training repetitions that burn hours, as if they were shells. The escort screen was thin because every destroyer spared was a convoy unescorted somewhere else. The air umbrella was a phrase, not a presence, because the pilots were spent, and the runways in Kyushu were already blistered. The big ship carried layers of anti-aircraft guns and miles of cable that tied them to a power plant deep in her bones, and the men at those guns were brave, and the power plant was sound. They would meet the sky with fire because that is what steel understands. The Americans faced a different arithmetic. Okinawa had to be fed hour by hour across water that could not be owned by proclamation. What threatened that bridge was not just this sortie, but the idea behind it, that a single concentrated surface blow might rip a hole in the perimeter and let desperation swim through. The carriers had one answer. They trusted, stop the blow at sea with speed and coordination that left no room for the other side to improve by improvising. That meant finding early fixing and striking in strands that braided into a rope. It meant keeping the combat air patrol disciplined while decks rotated through launch and recovery, while tanking tracks and deck loads became a language the flight officers spoke at a glance. The problem was never merely to sink, it was to keep the tempo unbroken. On the Japanese flagship, the junior radar officer understood tempo without the word. He learned it from the sweep rate of his set, from the pace at which returns grew more certain, and the intervals between bearings shortened. The headset carried voices that wore calm like a uniform. He could hear the bridge asking for range rate, the gunnery office asking for verification, the captain asking for weather. He could also hear silence in places where there should have been other ships. Other reports, an outer ring of eyes. A destroyer cut far out ahead to sniff for submarines and sent back a clean sea. Another worried too close to the battleship's wake because fear prefers company. The officer marked the scope and remembered the brief the ship's best chance lay in speed and closing the distance before the enemy turned the air into a machine. He ran a finger along the edge of the display, as if the friction might add knots to the hull. On the American side, a controller inside a combat information center the size of a city apartment listened to returns paint themselves into patterns. The room had its own weather cool air from a fan-warm breath, the electrical tang of paint on Bakelite. He did not see the sea. He saw lines of approach altitudes penciled into memory and gaps that needed closing. The first stat he carried like a charm was simple and near to hand. The strike cruised at roughly 200 knots on the long leg, in a figure that mattered because it made minutes into miles and miles into choices. Time on target would be a decision, not a hope, and the decision would be enforced by radios that made the formation a single machine. He spoke call signs with the mildness of a librarian and carved attack windows in the air with his voice. Between the two rooms, one with a view of sea and one with a view of signals, lay the ship itself, a paradox that made its own weather. Deep down, the shafts turned with a steadiness that comforted engineers because it repeated. Above crews at the 25mm mounts, braced for blast, they had known in practice and feared in fact. They had learned to track the sky in arcs that burned muscles and hope alike. The main battery stood ready to speak in a language too slow for what was coming, and the men who served it knew as much without admitting it even to themselves. In the operations office, a chart lay open to Okinawa, and someone had set a pencil across it, like a horizon line. The ship was solving toward that line. The other side was solving toward the ship. Constraints closed in fuel measured not in tanks, but in options, air cover, that existed only as a plan, a doctrine built for duelists asked to fight swarms. The Japanese staff framed the mission as offering up strength to draw the enemy down and away from the beaches, and there was logic in that offering. Offerings are not bargains, though. They are declarations. The Americans read the declaration in plain language. They did not need to admire it to respect it. They tuned radios, checked depth settings, counted torpedoes, and decided which squadrons would go where. In the ready rooms, men closed their eyes and saw ships outlined in chalk on blackboards, guessed where directors might fail. First imagined wakes and propellers and which side would be heavier after 3 hits. Then they realized the young officer on the big ship and the controller without a window, that the decisive range had already been crossed, and it was measured in minutes rather than miles. For one, it arrived as a thickening of echoes. For the other, it arrived as an ease in the voice net, when everything that had to be in place was in place. Somewhere above, low cloud circles tightened into arrows, and arrows became lines of fall on moving steel. Somewhere below, men wrapped ammo in ritual to keep their hands from shaking, and found that ritual worked because it gave their hands something to do. The problems had been stated on opposite sides of an ocean years earlier. Guns against airplanes, armor against doctrine, and the solutions were meeting now over green water. The ship leaned a fraction and corrected. The controller leaned into his microphone and did not raise his voice. The day's stakes were not courage or reputation. They were tempo and reach, and who would set both first. They had built her to decide questions with weight. The answer was embedded in every rib and plate. Start with steel, then make it thicker than anyone else would dare. The armor scheme rose around the machinery, like a fortress sunk inside a moving hill belt, deep and oblique decks, layered barbettes, sleeved in rings of protection. In the turret wells, the gears were taller than men, and turned with a patience that made gun crews feel small. The main battery, the ship's public face, was 9 mouths 46-centimeter bores that could throw a 1.46-ton shell beyond 42 kilometers and make distance feel like an accomplice. When the breech blocks closed, the sound had weight. When the recoil cylinders took the blow, the deck trembled in a way that comforted those who believed tremor meant control. The doctrine under all of it was simple enough to draw on a chalkboard, find the range straddle correct, and let mass write the sentence. Yet the machinery that made the guns speak was a second ship inside the first. Deep below, ammunition rode armored conveyors like offerings moving toward an altar. Teams in handling rooms worked in a choreography that did not tolerate delay. Powder bags, lifted shells, guided rammers, set interlocks cleared. Above, the fire control instruments took in angles and times and returned corrections as if the horizon were a set of numbers waiting to be made obedient. The optical directors were good, and the men who manned them were better. They had trained their eyes across years of empty sea until haze became a language. But haze has its own ideas, and the Pacific's long swell can turn precision into suggestion. The ship carried radar now, and on good days the air search sets could sketch the sky in strokes that even an old gunnery officer would respect. But sketches are not measurements, and the wiring to knit everything together had been threaded through a body that had been designed before such wires existed. Speed had been a kind of faith. In trials, the ship had reached 27.4 knots, a number that sat in officers' heads like a talisman because it turned hours into options. Every knot shaved minutes off danger's approach. Every minute made the main battery's promise more likely to be kept. Engineers loved the shafts for their honesty. When revolutions climbed, the hull answered. When the helm asked for a turn, the rudders bit. The hull's enormous inertia felt like a weapon. Momentum carried the ship through water that tried to drag at her skirts. But momentum is neutral in its loyalties. It helps a charge as much as a retreat. When counter-flooding and damage control begin to fight the sea inside the hull, speed becomes a question the ship asks herself, and sometimes can't answer. Against the sky, they had laced a net of smaller teeth. By 1945, the decks bristled with tubs and tripods and splinter shields. The count was proud and public among the crew, 162 of the ship's quick 25s, plus the big dual-purpose mounts that could loft a bursting shell into the measureless blue. Numbers, though, hide decisions. The 25s kicked and chattered. Their sights were clever on paper and cruel in spray. Their magazines emptied with the suddenness of a breath, and hands that loaded them became the ship's pulse. A director can marry guns into a choir only as long as cables carry orders and the choir keeps its footing. Blast fragments and heat conspire to make soloists out of orchestras. When one mount loses power and goes to hand train, its field of fire narrows to what one man can muscle. Courage stretches range by inches, not yards. The junior radar officer had memorized the way the set misbehaved when the big guns fired. The trace would ripple, the baseline would stutter, and for a heartbeat, the sky would become a storm of meaningless light. He had learned to ride that heartbeat, to borrow it the way a swimmer borrows a wave. He knew which bearings were honest and which were lies told by cloud or ducting or echo. He knew, too, the limits of what he could give his shipmates: azimuth clean enough to point eyes and barrels range good enough to warn, not good enough to predict. The set could not command fighters they did not have. It could not sort a multi-axis raid into solvable parts. Information that arrives seconds late is a kind of poetry, beautiful, sometimes true, rarely useful. What the ship did have was discipline in depth. Damage control parties walked their routes with wrenches and chalk. Valve wheels wore fingerprints into their paint. Vent closures hung on hooks like prayers waiting to be spoken. Men had learned to feel the ship's condition through their boots, to know when a new vibration meant a pump had joined the chorus or left it. The captain kept his voice low on purpose. The executive officer repeated orders as if translation could make them more certain. Every compartment lived inside a ritual, and rituals bind fear entwined, thin enough to see but strong enough to work. And still the physics refused to flatter. A shell that flies for 40 seconds cannot hit an airplane that can change its mind 3 times before impact. A director that loses power becomes a ring sight above salt wind. The main battery's grace stabilized mass, and the austere beauty of a perfect salvo had been crafted to fold long horizons into a single calculation. But the calculation had moved. The newest truth on the ocean was not iron against iron, not thickness against caliber. It was timing against timing, beams against bearings, the reach of a radio net against the reach of an optical rangefinder. The big ship could still hurt anything that dared to be a silhouette at the wrong distance. The enemy had learned not to be a silhouette. The officer on headphones tried for a moment to imagine the ship as the Americans might see her on a plotting board that turned water into paper and speed into pencil lines. She would be a symbol at first, then a set of coordinates, then a schedule. What the designers had wanted for her to decide a day with a broadside would be answered by men who decided days with launches and recovery cycles with tanker tracks and holding stacks with target groups divided and numbered. From his station, the officer could only turn numbers into warnings and warnings into bearings. He felt the ship reply with its own language the rise and fall of the deck, the delayed echo of a command hammering down 5 decks, the cough of a generator catching. When he closed his eyes, he could hear the ship without the sea fans, pumps, the faint clatter of trays, the intermittent thud of doors dogged for action. When he opened them, the scope swept the beam reached, and the returns came back thicker and closer. He wiped the glass with a cloth he kept folded in his pocket, a useless gesture he made anyway. The set hummed like a patient animal. Steel has its own kind of faith, he thought. It keeps its promises until the world changes the question. The ship around him, the greatest argument steel had ever made, was about to answer a question it had not been designed to hear. They found them first with soundless eyes. At altitude, the pathfinders rolled level, and the world turned into grids, and timing, a long leg flown at 200 knots, and a last minute that felt like logic, catching up with courage. Radios stitched squadrons into one body. The lead pilot could feel the machine beneath him settle into intention, not speed. The altimeter ticked down toward the point where men stopped mentioning numbers out loud. Far below, wakes stitched a pale seam on green water. Even this far up, the big ship looked like a verdict, brassy rectangular, the geometry of mass. He nudged the formation a degree left, as if moving a pencil line on paper. On the battleship, the junior radar officer watched the returns resolve from guesses into shapes. Bearings changed with the deliberation of men who knew they were being watched. He called range in the tone he had been taught to use for weather. The gunnery office asked for confirmation twice, then once more. The director crews swung metal as if hostages to it, and the sky above the bridge darkened in a way that had nothing to do with cloud. He knew with the numb clarity of routine that the first wave would arrive as a lesson and a test at the same time. The ship made ready to grade both. On the carrier's flight decks ran like factories that had memorized a song. Chalks out, props bite. A marshal's gloved hand cuts and points. Bombs hang under burnished wings like punctuation too heavy to ignore. Torpedoes slung low in cradles are turned by men who know their weight the way you know a friend's stride. In the combat information centers, voices flattened into instruments. Strike leaders took their last bearings and climbed or sank to their lanes. In the skydivers' high torpedo planes, low fighters above and between, a hierarchy drawn in air. Time on target was not an ambition. It was a number that locked into place when the first element dipped and the second shifted to cover. If anyone felt fear, they addressed it through checklist and cadence until it had to make an appointment. The first pass came from above because that is where shock lives. Dive brakes opened like the gills of machines. Air shook along corrugations and rivet lines. The sea doubled and treble copied itself in the glass. The target filled the sight not as a ship, but as a set of rectangles and circles, turrets, barbettes, bridge stacks, places where a bomb could bury itself and ask questions of steel that only heat could answer. Down they came through crossed tracer winking beads strung up from the decks. The ship answered with the flat juddering clap of 127s and the furious knitting of the 25s. Blast tore at rangefinders and blew the breath out of men on exposed mounts. A bomb struck aft and vanished inside, leaving only a cough in the ship's voice. Another smashed a boat deck into combed splinters. The junior radar officer braced for a moment that the set always hated the world turned to static, and then the picture returned, stuttering, and true enough. Low on the water, the torpedo planes worked with the patience of carpenters, measuring angles with their bodies. The leader held his line until the enemy's bow chewed up too much horizon, then eased off to widen the spread. They had been told where most of the heavy steel lived and which side to feed. They had been told to accept spray as weather and head on as an argument that could be won only by stubbornness. Wake and wakes met. Guns reached flattening arcs that could not quite meet the eye level of men skimming curving water. The first tracks walked toward the port bow, and then the port quarter in a sequence meant to saw at the ship's balance. On board, phones screamed port list before the deck had decided how far it wanted to go. Counter-flooding valves spun like alarm clocks winding backward. The helmsman carved a shape that made sense to him and to the sea, but not to the gunners who just lost an arc. Between waves, the surface litter built a language. Rafts cut free lay like punctuation marks. Smoke slid under the wind and then rose reluctantly. Damage control teams moved with choreographed urgency hoses, shouldered hatches dogged, splinter patches muscled into place and bolted with hands that would tremble later. Aft, the big directors still had their dignity, but one had gone dumb, another deaf. Power peeled back from circuits that had seemed permanent. The 25s closest to the bridge were already dark with cordite, the loaders' sleeves pasted to their forearms by sweat and propellant dust. The junior radar officer felt the ship answer questions he could not ask: how much water taken, how many compartments tired, how many men needing air where there was none. He called another bearing. It sounded like a prayer. Above, the second wave arrived with less ceremony and more certainty. This time, fighters tore across the flak pattern, first biting at gun crews with strafing runs that pinned heads and slowed hands. Then the divers cut in again, this time aimed like punctuation shone at the bridge wings and the after superstructure, where fire could migrate into the nerve paths of the ship. A bomb broke open a trunk line, and the lights on one side of the plotting room went out. Instruments that had promised to be calm in crisis became unlit promises. The ship still moved at warship speeds, but not at the speed her officers carried in their heads when they whispered 27.4. The engine room gave everything it had and asked for nothing back. Engineers watched needles as if the needles were watching them. The torpedo planes returned to the plan and to the lesson the first runs had taught. They spaced wider, approached from angles that lured the rudder into one compromise and then punished it for choosing. Port took more. There was a doctrine to it now, a deliberateness that tasted like inevitability. Splashes climbed and fell. One track ran too proud and passed harmless. Another found exactly the line between the armor and the sea and wrote its name in white water and steel fragments. The list stepped from rumor to number. The main battery's elegant geometry, whose circles had ruled the ship's identity, collapsed into arcs that could not clear water. Somewhere a boatswain shouted something fierce and human that no one quite heard. Then they realized on both sides that coordination itself was the weapon. The Americans felt it in the ease with which timing windows stayed open, in the way separate groups, arriving from separate altitudes, seemed to be members of a single sentence. The Japanese felt it in the way their local successes, one torpedo dodged, one bomber driven off, one fire smothered, refused to add up to a change in the story. A destroyer shouldered in to lay smoke and became a brief world of white and courage. The smoke shredded under wind and blast. The junior radar officer watched the set paint another inbound and could predict now how his own mouth would form the numbers. He tasted lacquer and heat, and the metallic sweetness that meant the ship's lungs were working hard. Between attacks, there was a quiet that was not rest. Men looked at one another and did not speak because the words were too expensive. The captain's voice came over the circuit, as level as ever, laying out orders whose form had been practiced in calmer water. The ship answered, as she had been taught to answer. Pumps thudded. Ammunition moved. Hoses snaked. The officer put his hand flat on the console and felt the tiniest tremor, as if somewhere something that should have been steady had learned to hesitate. He thought without bitterness that size could not be a shelter, only a place to stand a little longer. High above, the third set of arrows straightened for their runs, as if drawn by someone who had practiced the gesture all morning. The sea did not change its color. The ship did not change its shape. But the day's equation had. It was no longer about what one salvo, one bomb, or one torpedo could do. It was about what sequences could guarantee, and the guarantee was arriving on schedule. Reliability is the quiet general. It does not shout on deck or pose well in photographs, but it makes schedules obey. The American system worked in the wild because every link had been rehearsed until it became unremarkable. Carrier engines ran at tempos that made launch intervals predictable. Ordnance crews treated fuses and fins like a ritual that could not be shortened without inviting luck to sit at the table. In the combat information centers, grease pencils traced arcs that had been drawn yesterday and the day before. When the controller said 2 minutes, the decks and the sky matched him because the machines underneath the words were healthy. Reliability turned planning into physics. Training made courage cheap. Pilots who had flown unglamorous anti-shipping strikes for months understood the geometry of a large hull better than they understood sleep. They had learned to read awake for rudder intent, to feel the difference between flak thrown in anger and flak driven by a director that still had power. Dive bomber leaders could smell an opening in a ship's superstructure the way a hunter smells weather. Torpedo sections had practiced the discipline of spacing and timing until each aircraft was a bead on a wire rather than a hero in a painting. The lesson that mattered most ran under all the others. If one run failed, the next would not repeat its mistake, it would incorporate it. Learning cycles spun at the speed of radios. Radios were the bloodstream. The net that tied fighters, divers, torpedo planes, and controllers into one body did not ask for genius. It asked for clarity and timing. Frequency plans were boring by design. Brevity codes took experience and turned it into short words that carried entire paragraphs of intent. When a section lead said he was feet wet, someone 100 miles away could begin a calculation that involved deck cycles and tanker tracks and still make it sound like a conversation about the weather. A carrier group could be many voices, but one sentence. The enemy heard only fragments, a buzz in headphones, a burst of syllables that arrived too late to rearrange steel. Fuel which the battleship rationed like hope was something the Americans spent to buy tempo. Tankers and deck crews had turned refueling into a moving factory. Aircraft topped off, circled, and slid into strike orbits without turns that wasted minutes. The system treated distance as an ally because the distance could be crossed at will. Where the big ship read knots as survival, the carriers read knots as scheduling. Fuel was not just endurance. It was the ability to keep the rope-braided fighters to pin heads and strip directors, divers to open nerves, torpedo planes to tilt the hull until geometry betrayed the guns. When the rope tightened, each strand knew its place. Doctrine did not arrive that morning. It had been accumulating behind every success and failure since the first deck trials. The rule set was simple to say and hard to live. Find early fix, often attack in sequences that create a problem the enemy cannot reconfigure fast enough to solve. The ships that enabled it, pickets with radar nets, carriers with patient engines, destroyers with hoses and hearts, were not glamorous, but they made the timing real. A single brilliant pilot could not change the day. A single failure would not break it. The doctrine assumed imperfection and outlived it. On the battleship, discipline answered doctrine for as long as steel and men could match it. Damage control parties became musicians of valves and shoring. Fires learned to hate certain names because those men arrived with foam and will. Guns that lost power became arms and backs. Magazines that starved took ammunition by hand through mazes that design had never intended. The junior radar officer felt pride and grief braided so tight he could not separate them. He could give bearings and ranges with a steadiness that felt like character. He could not give his ship a second network, a second pair of lungs. The ship's anti-aircraft suite fought the sky with fury and physics both, but the physics bit deepest. The 25 millimeters were everywhere, and insufficient at once, superb at punishing a careless pass, punished themselves by blast and reload cadence. Director power, when present, could make a choir out of them. Vibration and fragments broke the hymn into solos. The big dual-purpose mounts impressed the eye and briefly the sky, but their best work demanded a steadiness that list and smoke refused to grant. In design, the layers overlapped. In reality, gaps opened where timing punched through. American timing carried a technician's signature. The first dive sequence forced heads down and hands away from director wheels. Strafing passes scissored across platforms to buy a few dozen seconds where calculations could not be made. The torpedo planes did not seek miracle treks. They sought the angles that compelled the rudder to choose wrongly twice. A list that began at 2 degrees stole arcs the way interest steals principal. When the list grew, reload paths kinked, doors jammed, and men carried ammunition around corners that hadn't existed an hour earlier. Engineering had built redundancies. Timing turned them into detours. Communication inside the big ship tried to outpace damage. Sound-powered phones kept talking where wire had failed. Runners took messages into heat that ate paper. Orders stayed cool because the captain kept them that way, and cool orders keep men from making large mistakes in small spaces. Pumps found purchase. Flooding argued and lost in compartments where ritual and wrenches met. Somewhere a generator took a breath it did not have and kept a panel alive for 3 more minutes. Those minutes mattered. They were spent wisely. They bought more shooting, more steering, more ship. And yet, the larger net kept closing. To the controller, the picture looked like competence turning into inevitability. A second strike window remained open without being forced. Replacement fighters slid into top cover because tanker tracks had been laid with margin. To the pilots, the day looked like work meeting plan. Briefed altitudes, held voice nets, stayed clear, and the target answered to the same physics as yesterday's, only larger. To the junior radar officer, inevitability sounded like bearings he could now predict before he said them. He felt the set's heartbeat steady and loyal, and knew loyalty was not enough. In that crucible, the difference between courage and outcome became visible. Courage kept hoses running and guns loading when senses screamed to stop. Courage tied officers to duty stations and made hands reach for hot steel that no longer looked like a friend. Outcome belonged to the system that could keep its own courage cheap by embedding it in checklists, spare parts, and repetition. The ship that had been built to decide with weight found herself cross-examined by timing radios and doctrine. She answered as long as she could, with dignity and with harm to those who dared too close. But the wild favors the repeatable, and the repeatable had come to sea that morning, wearing headsets and stopwatches, turning weather and distance into servants, insisting that each separate act make sense only as part of a sequence. The turning point did not look like a revelation. It looked like a number. The inclinometer on the bulkhead had been creeping all morning, the needle a slow confession, but now it touched a mark the junior radar officer had only seen in drills and diagrams. 10 degrees, then 12, edging toward a limit that manuals treat with politeness and engineers discuss with the seriousness of a cliff. The ship still moved at warship speeds, but the number stole futures from her geometry. Arcs that had been promises became negotiations. The main battery's circle, that proud measure of power, shrank to a crescent that could not be persuaded to lift above the horizon in time. The officer said the bearings heard his own voice remain level and watched the scope breathe its faithful heartbeat. The set could not lie. It returned the truth at the sweep rate given to it. More inbound intervals kept altitudes layered. The machine was calm. The ocean was not. On the flight decks far away, a controller used a different instrument to see the same moment. He did not have an inclinometer. He had cadence. The second strike window held without friction. Fighters flowed, dive groups checked in on schedule. Torpedo sections reported clean drops and clean egress. Even the expected noise-jamming weather bruised radios fell inside margins the plan had allowed for. He had learned long ago that when friction refuses to appear, the target is carrying it for you. He spoke a sentence about recovery order and did not raise his voice. The room smelled of pencil shavings and coffee gone cold. Outside, the Pacific drew a neat line around a trouble it would soon erase. Below the battleship's bridge, the damage reports found a rhythm as regular as bad news can be. Counter-flooding held the list at 14 degrees long enough to buy more shooting. Pumps bit and bit again. A smashed trunk line was isolated. A hatch that had stuck like a bad memory finally gave under shoulders and curses. Men carried ammunition in relays that kinked around corners the designers had not meant to be corners. The forward director, shamed by fragments and heat, went to local control and fought like a proud man with a broken wrist. Aft, a dual-purpose mount recovered power, then lost it, then took orders over a sound-powered phone whose mouthpiece was hot to the touch. The officer heard a loader laughing, a sudden bright sound that meant shock or bravery or both. He called another bearing. The set's trace jittered as blast made the world stutter, then settled and painted more approach. The next run did not announce itself as decisive. It approached at the measured 200 knots that had become the day's grammar low and wide on the port quarter, where earlier luck and doctrine had agreed the ship was most persuadable. Fighters reached across the deck with stitching lines that solved small problems. Hands slowed heads, went down a loader, miscounted a director's crew, lost one more second of concentration to the hot wind. Then the torpedoes walked in with that carpenter's patience again, one proud two, correct a fourth, that struck exactly where the armor's argument grew thin near the floor of the sea. The hit did what math always meant for it to do. The list took a full step to 16 degrees. Below, rails that were meant to be flat became slopes. Wheeled things became grudges. A man's body became cargo he could not will into lightness. The gunnery officer asked for speed. The answer came back as revolutions and hope. The engineer of the watch requested a fraction more steam and found he had already requested it 5 minutes earlier. Somewhere, a junior petty officer made the decision to keep a generator online past the hour that prudence would have ordained, and that decision bought 3 minutes of life for a panel whose dials kept a choir together that the sea was trying to turn into soloists. Those minutes were not thrown away. They were spent. The big guns spoke once more with a grandeur that the men felt in their bones, and the sound reminded them they belonged to something that could still scar the sky. But grandeur does not level decks. The inclinometer did not climb back. The next dive sequence sought nerves, not armor. Bombs found the places where heat and power make decisions, a junction that fed directors, a room where men who did not see daylight controlled the part of the ship that pretended to. Fires argued their doctrine. Foam and water told them they could be taught. For a moment, the ship's voice steadied. The phones took messages without coughing. The radar trace held truer between blasts. The officer allowed himself one breath that did not taste like lacquer. Then he watched the scope sketch new blips in from a bearing that had been quiet all morning. The sky, unsentimental as ever, had simply opened another door. There was at last an admission that had to be made inside quiet hearts. It arrived differently for each man. For the helmsman, it came through the wheel, the feel of the rudder, refusing to bite the way a proud animal refuses a halter. For the loader, it came through the weight of a magazine that should have been heavy, and now was merely stubborn, because hands had less leverage on a tilted deck. For the officer at the radar, it came as an inversion. He could say the next bearings before the sweep gave them to him. The timing had become predictable, which meant control belonged elsewhere. He kept speaking. A man's job is sometimes to narrate the shape of his own narrowing options. The controller, too, felt a change, one of those small gradients an experienced hand treats as a gauge. The escort's flak pattern grew thinner across one quadrant and hotter in another. The smoke screen that had briefly taught the eye to hesitate tore under wind that no longer met enough upright steel to catch it properly. Replacement fighters slid into top cover without being dragged there by emergency. A torpedo element reported clean with a voice that had run laps around fear and come back breathing easily. He marked 3 more minutes for recovery and used the margin to buy one last neatness in the attack stack. Clean windows are not mercy. They are proof. The battleship's roll crossed a point engineers call a name and sailors call a warning. 18 degrees flirted with 19. The main battery's spirit outlived its geometry, but spirit cannot raise iron above water when trunnions begin to dream of the horizon. Somewhere forward, a boatswain's mate tied his captain to the place honor said he should be. The knot was perfect, because perfection is the last dignity men can keep. Aft, a party forced a wedge under a door and found the compartment beyond it, already a different kingdom air, the wrong temperature, light the wrong color, floor, no longer loyal to horizontals. The ship began to write the last part of her story with the slow handwriting of mass. Then the sea decided. A pattern of hits that earlier had been a rumor became a verdict. The port side no longer argued. It accepted. The rudder answered with a slowness that made corrections into suggestions. The inclinometer needle chose a side of the dial and did not return to the middle. Somewhere a magazine officer read a temperature that lived at the edge of a book's last page and made the sober decision that separates explosion from echo. Water moved where powder had meant to wait. The ship listened to itself and understood. The junior radar officer stayed at his post because that is what a post is. The set still drew breath. The trace still came. The bearings still formed themselves into the sentence the sky had been writing since morning. He realized that his screen had become a mirror, not of the enemy, but of the system that was killing them, timing, that did not tire doctrine, that did not improvise because it did not have to. He looked once at the inclinometer, once at the sweep, and then back to the numbers he could give the men around him. The turning point had not been a single impact or a single roar. It had been a number becoming a boundary, and a boundary becoming a fate. They would later say the end was a flower on the sea, a rising shape too large to be believed, and too brief to be remembered properly. In the moment, it was only brightness without center, a pressure that arrived inside bones, before it reached ears, a kind of light that made shadow irrelevant. The list became surrender. The ship rolled with the dignity of a cathedral closing its own doors. Men who had memorized stations slipped along decks that had lost their arguments with gravity. Hands found lines out of habit, and then let go because habit had nothing to hold. Somewhere a bell tried to ring and failed. Somewhere a voice called a name and then used rank instead when memory buckled. The junior radar officer kept the headset on because he had never learned the ceremony for taking it off. The scope still drew its circle, but the picture was not the sky anymore. It was a confetti of metal and heat floating where a schedule had once been. He heard the bridge as if it were down a hallway in a different house. At his elbow, someone touched the console, an almost domestic gesture, and then was gone. The room changed color the way a day changes weather. He looked for bearings and found only pieces. When the order to abandon ship reached him, it arrived with the softness of a courtesy. He stood, felt the angle of the deck argue with his knees, and made his way toward a rectangle of daylight that did not seem to belong to the ship he knew. Outside, the air had the taste of wire and steam. The water around the hull was busy in a way that made the ocean look like a workshop's floor planks, boxes, oars, a ladder that had been meant for some calmer future. A destroyer shouldered a wake into smoke and then disappeared behind its own courage. The officer climbed down a line that had forgotten it once hung straight. He lowered himself into a world that smelled like lacquer, made into weather, kicked free to keep from being pulled under by something too large to love, and came up inside noise. The ship was no longer a single thing. It was a map of currents. Distance turned the ruin into composition stacks and masts, assembling a last silhouette before folding into the seam between sea and sky. The bloom that ended the argument rose with the indifference of chemistry fulfilling a promise. It put its lesson into the air so loudly that for a beat the flak stopped and the wind forgot itself. The wave that followed did not choose who to strike. Men in the water felt it pass through them, as if a larger body had swum by and found them uninteresting. The officer turned in a slow circle to count heads he could not count, and then stopped counting because the numbers would not stay where he put them. Rescue began as motions, not declarations. Boats appeared from edges of vision. Ropes trailed like unfinished sentences. Voices reached across water without needing names. The enemy was far away and also everywhere up in the sky, as small crosses of shadow over the horizon, as decks and doctrine inside the very timing of the waves. The officer let himself be pulled into a shape of wood that called itself a boat because men were in it doing what boats do. He lay with his head against the gunwale and listened to breath that was not quite his. The world contracted to handspans and the rhythm of oars. Afterward, on land that did not move, he would learn the words other people would use. Operation Task Force Windows recovery estimates. He would read numbers that were true enough to quiet arguments and vague enough to make memory correct them in private. He would hear that the great ship had not been killed by one thing, but by a sequence that refused to leave gaps for bravery to occupy. He would say very little. When asked what it had felt like, he would reach for the only sentence that fit in the space left behind by the ship and the men and the light. He would remember the headphones, the scope's steady sweep, the horizon held tight like a wire, and the way the first certainty had sounded in his ear before the sky showed its face. He would say it softly, without ornament, as a fact rather than a performance. On that day in that sea, what awaited us was death and nothing else, thunder without thunder, written by timing instead of gods, and signed by the quiet machinery of a new century.